The 12 disciples of Jesus explained who they really were and how they died. Imagine walking alongside Jesus, seeing miracles happen before your eyes, hearing his teachings directly from his own lips, witnessing the resurrection of the dead, storms being calmed, and multitudes being fed with just a few loaves of bread and fish. Now imagine that, despite all of that, you still had doubts, fears, failures, and moments of weakness. This was the reality for the 12 disciples of Jesus. We often think of them as almost perfect figures, but the truth is quite different. They were fishermen, tax collectors, nationalists, simple, ordinary men. Some were impulsive, others were shy. Some demonstrated extraordinary faith, while others struggled with deep doubts. Nevertheless, Jesus chose them for a mission that would change the course of world history. After the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, these men took the message of the gospel to distant lands. They faced persecution, imprisonment, torture, and, according to Christian tradition, almost all died because of the faith they proclaimed. But who were these men really? How did they live? What did they do after Jesus' ascension? And how did each of them meet their end? In this video, we'll learn the complete story of Jesus' 12 disciples, from their humble origins to the events that transformed their names into some of the most well-known in human history. And let's start with perhaps the most famous of them all, Peter. Pedro, before becoming one of the leaders of the early church, Peter was just a fisherman named Simon. He lived in the region of Galilee and worked daily on the waters of the lake alongside his brother Andrew. Fishing was hard work. It demanded long hours, constant physical effort, and offered little guarantee of success. Pedro probably imagined he would spend the rest of his life in this simple routine, supporting his family and following the traditions of his people. But everything changed when he met Jesus. According to the Gospels, Jesus approached Peter while he was working and made a surprising invitation: "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." From that moment on, Pedro left the nets behind and began a journey that would completely transform his life. Among all the disciples, Peter was perhaps the most impulsive. He was the first to speak, the first to act, and often the first to make a mistake. It was Peter who had the courage to get out of the boat and walk on the water toward Jesus. But it was also he who began to sink when he allowed fear to overcome his faith. It was Peter who declared that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But it was also he who tried to prevent Jesus from speaking about his own death. Her story is marked by highs and lows, courage and weakness, faith and doubt. The most painful moment of his journey occurred on the night of Jesus' arrest. Just a few hours earlier, Peter had vowed to remain faithful until death. However, when the danger truly arrived, he denied knowing Jesus 3 times. When the rooster crowed and Peter realized what he had done, he went out weeping bitterly. But their story didn't end with that failure. After the resurrection, Jesus restored Peter and gave him a new mission. From that moment on, he became one of the most important figures in early Christianity, preaching to crowds and helping to establish the first Christian communities. According to tradition, Peter spent his last years in Rome. During the persecution instigated by Emperor Nero, he was condemned to death. It is said that he asked to be crucified upside down, as he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same way as his master. From fisherman in Galilee to leader of the church, Peter became a symbol of transformation, showing that flaws do not prevent someone from fulfilling a greater purpose. But Peter was not the only fisherman called by Jesus. His brother Andre would also play an important role in this story. And although Peter became one of the best-known figures in Christianity, it was Andrew who first introduced him to Jesus. Before following Christ, Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist. He was part of the group of people who eagerly awaited the arrival of the Messiah promised in the Scriptures. When John the Baptist pointed to Jesus and declared that he was the Lamb of God, Andrew decided to follow him immediately. One of Andrew's most striking characteristics was his willingness to bring other people to Jesus. The first thing he did after recognizing the Messiah was to look for his brother Peter and say, "We have found the Christ." Without realizing it, Andrew was introducing to the world the man who would become one of the greatest leaders of the early church. In the Gospels, Andrew appears several times in the background. Unlike Peter, He was neither impulsive nor did he usually seek the spotlight. Even so, he played a fundamental role. It was Andrew who introduced Jesus to the boy who had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish before the multiplication of the loaves. He was also the one who brought some Greeks to Christ when they wished to meet him. His ministry shows that not everyone is called to lead crowds. Some change history simply by bringing people closer to the truth. After Jesus' ascension, Christian tradition states that Andrew traveled through various regions preaching the gospel. His journey is said to have taken him through territories near the Black Sea, Asia Minor, and Greece. In each place, he faced resistance, persecution, and opposition. According to the earliest accounts, Andrew was arrested by local authorities for refusing to renounce his faith. Condemned to crucifixion, he was reportedly tied to an X-shaped cross, which he considered a more dignified death than the cross used by Jesus. During the days he remained alive on the cross, tradition states that he continued preaching to the people who gathered around him. Because of this, the X-shaped cross became forever associated with his name. Andre's story reminds us that discreet people can exert extraordinary influence. But while Andrew was known for his quiet humility, the next disciple possessed a much more intense personality. His name was James. James, son of Zebedee. James was the son of Zebedee and the brother of John. Like Peter and Andrew, he was working as a fisherman when he received Jesus' call. The 2 brothers seemed to have strong personalities. So much so that Jesus gave them a curious nickname, Sons of Thunder. The exact reason for this name is unknown, but the Gospels offer some clues. Once, when a Samaritan village rejected Jesus, James and John asked if they should call down fire from heaven to destroy the place. It was an impulsive, intense, and passionate reaction. Over time, however, Jesus shaped that temperament. James became one of the closest members of Christ's inner circle. Among the 12 disciples, only Peter, James, and John were present at some of the most important moments of Jesus' ministry. They witnessed the resurrection of Jairus' daughter. They were present at the Transfiguration, when Jesus revealed his glory before them. And they accompanied the Master during moments of profound anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane. These experiences made James a privileged witness to extraordinary events. After the resurrection, he assumed an important role in the nascent Christian community. However, his ministry would be relatively short. The Book of Acts records that King Herod Agrippa decided to persecute the followers of Jesus in order to please some of the religious leaders of the time. Tiago became one of the targets of this persecution. Around the year 44 AD, he was executed by sword. He was the first of the 12 apostles to die as a martyr. His example showed that following Jesus could require the greatest of sacrifices. But it also demonstrated that the faith of those men was strong enough to face even death. While James was the first apostle to die, his brother John would have a completely different trajectory. John, while Peter is remembered for his leadership and Paul for his missionary journeys, John is often remembered for a special characteristic: his close relationship with Jesus. He was James' brother and worked alongside him in fishing before receiving the call to follow Christ. In the Gospels, John is often identified as the beloved disciple. This expression does not mean that Jesus loved the other disciples less, but reveals the close relationship that existed between them. John was present at crucial moments in the life of Christ. He participated in the Transfiguration. He accompanied Jesus to Gethsemane. And he remained close by during the crucifixion, when many other disciples had fled. It was to John that Jesus entrusted the care of his mother, Mary, while she lay dying on the cross. This gesture reveals the enormous trust that Christ placed in him. But John did not begin his journey as the serene man many imagine. Like his brother James, he had a strong temper. Over the years, however, his time with Jesus transformed his way of seeing the world. Therefore, his writings constantly emphasize themes such as love, grace, and communion. Traditionally, John is considered the author of the Gospel that bears his name, the 3 letters of John, and also the Book of Revelation. According to Christian tradition, he faced persecution during the reign of Emperor Domitian. He was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he received the visions recorded in the Book of Revelation. After returning from exile, He continued teaching and leading Christian communities. Unlike most of the apostles, John is believed to have died of natural causes at an advanced age. He would have been the last survivor among the 12. His life spanned generations. He saw the expansion of Christianity, witnessed persecutions, and followed the growth of the church far beyond Palestine. If Peter symbolizes courage and James represents sacrifice, John has become a symbol of faithfulness and perseverance. But the disciples were not made up only of fishermen. Among them was also a man who worked for the system most hated by Jews in his time. His name was Matthew. Matthew, if someone had asked first-century Jews who would be one of the least likely people to become a disciple of a religious teacher, many would have pointed to a tax collector. And that was exactly the profession that Matthew practiced. Tax collectors worked for the Roman government, collecting taxes from the local population. While some were honest, many were known for charging exorbitant amounts to enrich themselves at the expense of the people. Therefore, they were seen as traitors and frequently rejected by Jewish society. Matthew lived surrounded by money, but also by contempt. Then something unexpected happened. As he passed by his workplace, Jesus simply said, "Follow me." Without hesitation, Matthew left everything behind. He abandoned his profession, his source of income, and his old life to accompany that man from Nazareth. The decision surprised many people. How could someone considered a sinner and impure be accepted by a religious teacher? But it was precisely this type of barrier that Jesus came to break down. A short time later, Matthew gave a large banquet at his house. Among the guests were other tax collectors and people marginalized by society. When religious leaders criticized Jesus for associating with those people, he replied that he had not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Matthew's story has become a powerful symbol of transformation. He is traditionally recognized as the author of the Gospel of Matthew, one of the most important books of the New Testament. His Gospel presents Jesus as the Messiah promised in the Jewish scriptures and contains some of the best-known teachings of the Bible, including the Sermon on the Mount. After the resurrection, it is believed that Matthew traveled to various regions proclaiming the Gospel. The details of his final years vary according to ancient traditions, but most agree that he faced persecution and died because of his faith. From a tax collector rejected by society to the author of one of the most widely read Gospels in history, Matthew demonstrates that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace. But if Matthew is an example of transformation, the next disciple is often remembered for a different characteristic: doubt. Thomas' few disciples have received such a lasting reputation as Thomas. Even today, his name is often associated with skepticism. But his story is much deeper than that. Thomas appears several times in the Gospels, demonstrating a sincere and courageous personality. When Jesus decided to return to Judea, a region where his life was in danger, many of his disciples were worried. It was Thomas who declared, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This phrase reveals a man willing to remain loyal even in the face of risk. But it was after the crucifixion that his most famous episode occurred. When Jesus resurrected, he appeared to the disciples who were gathered together. Thomas, however, was not present. When the others told him what had happened, he replied that he would only believe it if he could see and touch the marks left by the nails. Days later, Jesus appeared again. This time, he addressed Thomas directly. He invited him to examine the wounds in his hands and in his side. Faced with that evidence, Thomas uttered one of the most powerful statements recorded in the Gospels, "My Lord and my God." His moment of doubt ended up transforming into one of the strongest confessions of faith in the New Testament. According to ancient Christian traditions, Thomas traveled very far after the ascension of Jesus. It is believed that he brought the gospel to India. Even today there are Indian Christian communities that associate their origin with the missionary work of Thomas. Reports state that he preached for years in that region, establishing faith communities and proclaiming the message of Christ. Like many of the other apostles, he eventually faced persecution. According to tradition, he was killed because of his preaching. The story of Thomas reminds us that sincere doubt does not have to be the end of faith. In many cases, it can be the path to an even deeper conviction. Philip among the disciples, Philip is often remembered as someone who asked questions. But these questions did not reveal disbelief. They showed a genuine desire to understand. Originally from the city of Bethsaida, Philip was called directly by Jesus. His reaction was immediate. After finding Christ, he sought out Nathanael and announced that he had found the one about whom Moses and the prophets wrote. This demonstrates enthusiasm and conviction. Felipe wanted to share what he had discovered immediately. During Jesus' ministry, it appears at several important moments. In the multiplication of the loaves, for example, Jesus asked Philip where they could buy food to feed the multitude. The question served as a test of his faith. On another occasion, during the Last Supper, Philip asked Jesus to show the Father to the disciples. Christ's response became one of the most profound statements in the Gospel of John. Jesus explained that whoever saw him also saw the Father. After the resurrection, tradition states that Philip dedicated his life to spreading the gospel. His missionary journeys are believed to have reached several cities in Asia Minor. Ancient accounts indicate that his message sparked both conversions and opposition. According to Christian tradition, he was eventually arrested by local authorities and executed because of his faith. His life demonstrates the importance of seeking understanding without losing faith in God. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael, of all the calls made by Jesus, few are as interesting as the encounter with Nathanael. When Philip found him and told him that he had found the Messiah, Nathanael responded with skepticism, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" The question reflected the common prejudice of the time. Nazareth was a small and unimportant town. But everything changed when Nathanael met Jesus in person. Even before being introduced, Jesus revealed that he knew details of his life. Surprised, Nathanael immediately recognized something extraordinary about that encounter. His response was impressive. He called Jesus the Son of God and King of Israel. Many scholars believe that Nathanael is the same disciple known as Bartholomew. Although he appears only a few times in the Gospels, Christian tradition attributes to him extensive missionary activity after the resurrection. Several accounts state that he took the gospel to regions of Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Armenia. In Armenia, in particular, its influence became an important part of the local Christian tradition. His missionary work reportedly provoked strong opposition from religious and political authorities. For this reason, according to the oldest traditions, he ended up suffering martyrdom. Regardless of the exact details of his death, his story remains associated with the courage to proclaim the gospel in distant and often hostile regions. The one who began by doubting Nazareth ended up dedicating his entire life to the man who came from there. But not all of the disciples had their stories widely recorded. Some remain almost hidden within the pages of the Bible. Even so, his role was important. This is the case of James, son of Alphaeus. James, son of Alphaeus, among the 12 disciples, some names are constantly mentioned. Others, however, remain almost silent in the Gospels. James, son of Alphaeus, is one of those cases. Little is known about his origins. He appears in lists of the apostles, but is rarely mentioned in specific episodes of Jesus' life. For this reason, many call him James the Less, not because of his importance, but possibly because of his age or stature, according to some traditions. Despite the lack of biblical details, his presence among the 12 is already significant. This shows that Jesus' calling did not depend on fame, social standing, or public prominence. James likely witnessed the same miracles, teachings, and challenges as the other disciples. He walked with Jesus, heard his words, and participated in the mission that would transform history. After the resurrection, ancient traditions suggest that he remained active in spreading the gospel, although records are scarce and varied. What is repeated in some sources is the idea that he also faced persecution for his faith and ended up dying as a martyr. Their story, though silent, represents something powerful. Not all who follow Jesus are seen, but all have a role within the same mission. While James represents silence, the next disciple stands out for his dedication in times of crisis. Judas Thaddeus is often confused with Judas Iscariot because of the name, but their stories are completely different. Thaddeus also appears only briefly in the Gospels, but one of them is quite significant. During the Last Supper, he asked Jesus how he would reveal himself to the disciples and not to the world. This question reveals someone who is attentive and deeply interested in understanding Christ's plans. In response, Jesus spoke about the importance of obedience and love as forms of divine manifestation. Following the ascension of Jesus, Christian tradition states that Judas Thaddeus dedicated his life to preaching the gospel in distant regions. He is said to have traveled through areas of Mesopotamia and Persia, bringing the Christian message to people who had never heard of Jesus. In many traditions, he is remembered as one of the great missionaries of early Christianity. Over the centuries, he also became known as the Saint of Impossible Causes, due to the popular devotion associated with his name. According to early accounts, his missionary work ended up provoking strong opposition. He was reportedly killed because of his faith, maintaining his conviction until the end. Judas Thaddeus shows that even those with little visibility in biblical texts can have a profound influence on the history of faith. Simon the Zealot in the Gospels. Simon is called the Zealot. This title likely indicates a prior connection with a Jewish group that strongly advocated for the liberation of Israel from Roman rule. If this is correct, then Simeon was part of a group with strong political and nationalist motivations. What is most impressive is that Jesus brought together people with completely different views within the same group of disciples. On one side, there were tax collectors working for Rome. On the other, there was someone possibly linked to a movement opposed to Rome. And yet, they were all called to the same mission. Simon appears only a few times in the Gospels, but his presence among the 12 is significant enough to show the diversity of Jesus' group. After the resurrection, ancient traditions claim that he took the gospel to different regions, although the details vary considerably between historical sources. Some accounts place him preaching in areas of Africa and the Middle East. Others suggest even more distant journeys. What remains consistent is the idea that Simon dedicated his life to spreading the message of Christ. And, like many of the other apostles, he ended up facing persecution and death because of his faith. Their story represents the union of people who, outside of Christ, might never have been on the same side. Judas Iscariot. Among all the disciples, Judas Iscariot is the name that carries the darkest weight. He too was chosen by Jesus. He too walked with him. He too witnessed miracles, heard teachings, and participated in the mission. But her story took a tragic turn. Judas was responsible for the group's money bag, which indicates a certain level of trust from the other disciples. However, the Gospels also suggest that he had internal conflicts related to money. At a certain point, Judas decides to betray Jesus. He approaches the religious authorities and agrees to hand over the master in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. The gesture is not merely a personal betrayal, but an event that directly triggers the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. After realizing the consequences of what he had done, Judas was overcome with remorse. He tries to return the money, but it's too late to undo what happened. According to biblical accounts, he ultimately takes his own life. His story is one of the most tragic in Scripture. It shows that proximity to the sacred is no guarantee of inner transformation. Judas had access to the same teachings as the other disciples, but his path took a different turn. Conclusion: Jesus' 12 disciples were not perfect heroes. They were ordinary men, full of flaws, doubts, and limitations. Nevertheless, they were chosen for an extraordinary mission. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, they took his message to different parts of the known world. They faced persecution, rejection, and, according to Christian tradition, many died because of the faith they proclaimed. Pedro was impulsive, but he became a leader. Andre was discreet, but he paved the way. James was intense and became a martyr. John matured and became a symbol of faithfulness. Matthew was rejected, but he wrote one of the most important Gospels. Thomas doubted, but he achieved one of the greatest confessions of faith. Felipe sought to understand. Bartholomew believed and dedicated himself. James, son of Alphaeus, remained silent but faithful. Judas Thaddeus carried the message to distant lands. Simon united extremes within a single calling. And Judas Iscariot shows the most tragic side of human freedom. Together, They form one of the most impactful stories in human history. And the most surprising thing is that it all started with a simple call: follow.